Derek Turner. When Los Angeles police and federal agents finished counting the cash they hauled out of Derek Turner's operation in the spring of 2016, the total came to roughly $1.8 million. About $600,000 of that was in single $1 bills, bundled and stacked like the deposits of a corner laundromat. To understand why a drug operation would be drowning in singles, you first have to understand exactly who Turner had built his business around. By the time investigators moved on him, Turner was in his late 40s and living quietly in the suburb of Cerritos, a long way from the corners he controlled. The Los Angeles police chief at the time, Charlie Beck, said Turner had been dealing in the city for something close to 3 decades. Detectives described him as a member of the Athens Park Bloods who had crossed one of the oldest lines in Los Angeles gang life to work alongside the Grape Street Crips. His product was cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. His customers were the homeless population of Skid Row. That last detail was the entire business model. On Skid Row, investigators said, dealers in Turner's network sold hits for as little as $1, priced so that even the most destitute person on the sidewalk could always scrape together enough for one more. Priced, in other words, so that $1 found on the pavement was a dose. That is why the money came back in ones. The captain who helped run the operation told reporters that the sheer volume of $1 bills said everything about how Turner made his living downtown. One investigator estimated that across roughly 20 years, Turner had overseen millions of dollars in cocaine and heroin sales, most of it $1 at a time, taken from people who had almost nothing left to give. That downtown district, a few dozen blocks pressed against the edge of the city's gleaming financial center, holds one of the largest concentrations of homeless people anywhere in the country. For Turner, it was a captive market that never dried up. The investigator who tracked the case, Mike Mitchell, said the operation had run for the better part of 2 decades, quietly converting addiction on those blocks into a steady, low-margin fortune. Detectives did not soften how they described him. They called him a known gang member who had built something durable and self-sustaining in a part of Los Angeles most of the city preferred to drive around rather than walk through. When they finally dismantled it, it stood as one of the larger Skid Row drug takedowns the department had ever carried out. The case against him came together slowly, built over a year-long wiretap investigation led by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office and the Police Department, working alongside federal drug agents. It was patient work. Detectives listened for months, mapping the supply, the runners, and the money before anyone moved. On April 26, 2016, teams struck around 20 locations at once. When officers came for Turner himself, they arrived at his Cerritos home before dawn, near 3:30 in the morning, in armored vehicles, and ordered him out of the house over a loudspeaker. They seized firearms, pounds of cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin, along with that nearly $1.8 million in cash. Handcuffed in the street with news cameras rolling, Turner turned toward the lenses and asked, without a trace of concern, whether they had managed to get his good side. So how do you build a criminal case around a customer base that most of the city had already decided not to see? Prosecutors charged Turner with conspiracy, possession of narcotics for sale, and receiving the proceeds of drug sales. He did not fall alone. 16 people were arrested across the sweep, among them a second principal named Louis McAdoo, along with 2 others, Chastity Jackson and Henry Walker. On August 7, 2017, Turner was sentenced to 11 years in state prison after admitting a prior felony conviction from 2008. Under the terms, he would have to serve 80% of that sentence before he could be considered for release. McAdoo received 13 years, Turner's attorney, Dan Chambers, pushed back on the Kingpin label that police and the press had fastened onto his client, arguing that Turner had never actually been the lead figure in the case at all. There was one more thread that few people ever heard about. A longtime police informant, identified in filings only as John Doe, later brought a claim against the city. He said his own commanding officer had approved payment for his work shortly after the bust, and he was seeking roughly $180,000 in damages, plus another $30,000 tied to the value of the seized weapons and drugs. The man who helped bring the operation down, in other words, ended up fighting the department for what he said he was owed. As of the most recent records, Derek Turner was still serving the 11-year state sentence handed down in 2017. He remains the case that turned $600,000 in single bills into the defining image of the modern Skid Row drug trade, an operation that grew fat on the smallest denomination of American money. Turner ran his operation out in the open, on sidewalks the city preferred not to look at. A generation before him, another operator ran his in plain sight as well, though his cover was not a street corner. It was a string of the most glamorous nightclubs in Los Angeles. Eddie Nash. In the summer of 1981, 4 people lost their lives inside a house on Wonderland Avenue in the hills above Hollywood. Almost everyone connected to the case seemed to believe they knew who had ordered it. And yet it would take nearly 20 years, 2 failed trials, a bribed juror, and finally a federal racketeering case before anything at all would stick to the man police were certain stood behind it. He was born Adel Garib Nasrallah in 1929 in Ramallah, and he came to the United States in the early 1950s with about $7 to his name. Under the name Eddie Nash, he turned that nothing into an empire of Los Angeles nightlife. He owned a long list of clubs and restaurants, including the Starwood in West Hollywood, one of the most famous rock venues in the city, and he held dozens of liquor licenses across town. To much of Los Angeles, he was a respectable, well-connected businessman. Police told a different story. They alleged that behind the velvet ropes ran a heroin and cocaine network, moved in part through the very venues that had made his name. To the city's nightlife, he was an institution. To the federal agents who would one day build a case against him, he was something else, a man who had learned he could buy almost anything he needed, including, at least once, a juror. The trouble began with a robbery. There was a loose crew known as the Wonderland Gang, a group of small-time robbers and addicts operating out of a house in Laurel Canyon, made up of men like Ron Launius and Billy Deverill. On June 29, 1981, they forced their way into Nash's home at gunpoint. They took drugs, jewelry, and cash, with estimates ranging from about $185,000 to as much as $1 million, and they grazed his bodyguard, Gregory Dials, with a bullet on the way out. An adult film actor named John Holmes, who moved between both worlds, had left a door unlocked for them. 2 of the men who had taken part in that robbery, David Lind and Tracy McCourt, happened not to be inside the Laurel Canyon house when the retaliation arrived. That absence is the only reason they lived. In the years that followed, the case became one of the most infamous in Los Angeles history. Its tangled cast of nightclub owners, drug dealers, and adult film performers picked over by reporters and later dramatized on film. Yet for all that attention, and all the pages written about it, the central question never changed across 2 full decades. Everyone had a theory about who had given the order. Almost no one could prove it in a courtroom. 2 days later, on July 1, 1981, the reckoning came. 4 members of that same crew, Ron Launius, Billy Deverill, Joy Miller, and Barbara Richardson, were fatally attacked inside the Laurel Canyon house. A 5th person, Susan Launius, survived with severe injuries. When investigators processed the scene, they found more than $1 million worth of cocaine still inside. Prosecutors would come to believe the attack was retaliation, ordered by Nash to answer the robbery of 2 nights earlier. But believing it and proving it would turn out to be 2 very different things. How do you convict a man when the people closest to the crime keep dying, disappearing, or refusing to talk? For years, the legal road was a series of dead ends. John Holmes was tried for the deaths and acquitted on June 26, 1982, though he served 110 days for contempt after refusing to testify. He died of complications from AIDS in 1988. Nash and Dials were finally charged in state court in 1990. The first trial ended with a hung jury that leaned 11-1 toward conviction, and it later emerged that Nash had bribed the lone holdout with $50,000. A retrial the following year ended in acquittal for both men. Dials died of liver failure in 1997. Twice the state had taken its shot, and twice Nash had walked. It was the federal government that eventually closed the gap. In 2000, after a 4-year investigation, Nash was arrested on a 16-count racketeering indictment covering drug trafficking, money laundering, jury tampering, and conspiracy tied to the Wonderland deaths. In September of 2001, at 72 years old and suffering from emphysema, he pleaded guilty to racketeering and money laundering. He admitted bribing the juror. He admitted sending associates to recover his stolen property from the Wonderland house. But he denied, through his attorney Donald Rowe, that he had any part in planning the deaths that followed. On October 12, 2001, he was sentenced to 37 months and fined $250,000, and he served only a short stretch of it before his release. The federal approach worked where the state had failed twice, and the reason is worth understanding. Prosecutors never had to prove that Nash lifted a hand inside that house. They only had to prove the enterprise itself, the drugs, the laundering, and the bribe, and let the pattern carry the weight the deaths alone never could. Eddie Nash died in 2014 at 85, never having been convicted of ordering the Wonderland deaths. John Holmes, before his own death, once described Nash as the most evil man he had ever known. After 2 decades of trials, that reputation is the only sentence that ever truly outlasted him. Nash hid his trade behind the glamour of clubs and liquor licenses. But the cocaine flood of the mid-1980s needed a different kind of figure, someone who could move Colombian weight in bulk and put it directly into the hands of the street. That man was barely old enough to rent a car. Brian Waterhead Bo Bennett. Federal wiretaps caught them ordering cocaine 2,000 pounds at a time. In a single year, investigators documented almost 15,000 kilograms moving through the operation, and the man sitting at the center of it was not a gang member and was only about 24 years old. Brian Bennett grew up after his family moved to Los Angeles from Michigan, and by his mid-20s, he had positioned himself at a junction almost no one else could hold. He was not in a gang himself, though his brothers ran with the Crips, and his single biggest customer, Michael Harris, was aligned with the Bloods. What made Bennett dangerous was not a set, it was a supplier. He had partnered with a Colombian figure tied to the Cali cartel named Mario Ernesto Villabona, and together they built what one major newspaper described as possibly the largest cocaine distributorship in the country, feeding street dealers from coast to coast. He was, in effect, a broker. He sat between the Colombians who controlled the product and the gangs who controlled the corners, and he took his cut off everything that moved between them. The scale is difficult to hold in your head. Reporting at the time described the ring distributing roughly 1,000 kilograms of crack cocaine every week across the United States, pushing product from Los Angeles out to Detroit, St. Louis, and Kansas City. Wiretaps documented nearly 15,000 kilos moving in under a year. The two men charged around $12,000 a kilo and split the profits, and by one account, in some weeks, Bennett personally pocketed $1 million. A Los Angeles police deputy chief called it the single most important partnership ever formed between a major South Central dealer and the Colombians, saying Bennett was supplying thousands of rock houses stretching all the way from Los Angeles to Detroit. This was the connection that helped turn the powder coming out of Colombia into the crack that flooded American cities. A network that size does not stay quiet forever. To hide the money, the organization laundered it through a mortgage company, check-cashing outlets, and a scatter of other front businesses, and the wiretaps eventually reached across Los Angeles and even into Denmark and Italy. The end came on November 19, 1988, after couriers carrying 500 kilograms were stopped in Missouri. Bennett was arrested at a $500,000 home in Tempe, Arizona. Villabona was taken in Malibu the same day. That single stop in Missouri was the thread that unraveled everything. Once the couriers and their 500 kilograms were in custody, the wiretaps and the paper trail did the rest, and an operation that had spent years feeding cities across the country came apart in a matter of weeks. So what happens to a man barely into his 20s who has been moving weight on the scale of a small cartel when the federal government finally has him on tape? The case, tried before United States District Judge William Rea in the Central District of California, was substantial. 6 defendants, including Bennett, Villabona, and Michael Harris, were convicted on May 18, 1990, after a trial that ran roughly 4 months, while 7 others had already pleaded guilty. The convictions covered conspiracy, possession with intent to distribute on the order of 1,000 kilograms each, money laundering, and running a continuing criminal enterprise. One of the prosecutors described the case as among the first to firmly establish the link between the Colombian cartels pouring cocaine into the country and the black street gangs distributing it on the other end. Here is where the record grows uncertain and where an honest account has to slow down. Bennett and Villabona were charged as principal administrators under the federal Kingpin statute, a charge that carried mandatory life without parole. Coverage from the time reported that they faced and were expected to receive exactly that. On appeal, though, the Ninth Circuit reversed several of the money structuring counts and sent the matter back, and Villabona was later resentenced to a term of years rather than life. What is clearly documented is the mandatory life exposure Bennett faced going in. What is not cleanly documented in the primary court record is the precise sentence he ultimately served, or the date he walked out. Villabona's path split from Bennett's after the appeal. As a Colombian national, he faced the prospect of deportation whenever his sentence finally ended, and he kept fighting his case in court for years, losing another challenge as late as 2015. Bennett's trail, by contrast, simply goes quiet. For a man once accused of helping supply thousands of rock houses stretching from Los Angeles to Detroit, the most striking thing about the end of his story is how little of it was ever committed to the record. The empire was enormous, mapped out in wiretaps and splashed across headlines. His personal reckoning was almost an afterthought. As of today, later interviews and accounts from true crime writers describe Brian Bennett as a free man, living quietly after the operation that once moved 1,000 kilos a week collapsed. The exact terms of that freedom, when it began and how it was granted, remain one of the gaps the public record never fully closed. Bennett's single largest customer had been in that same courtroom, convicted in that same trial. But that man's story did not end with a federal sentence. It took an almost unbelievable detour from a prison cell into the founding of one of the most influential record labels in American history. Michael Harry O. Harris. Michael Harris was already years deep into a prison sentence when, from behind bars, he helped move $1.5 million into a fledgling record label. That label became Death Row Records. And on the January morning in 2021, when a president signed his release, Harris walked out of federal custody after roughly 33 years inside. He was born in 1960 and grew up on the east side of South Central Los Angeles, affiliated with the bounty hunter Bloods of Watts. Through the 1980s, Harris and his brother David built a large cocaine operation that worked across gang lines and, like Bennett's, reached back to the Cali cartel, with reporting describing a network that spanned 11 states. Harris himself has claimed the operation once brought in close to $2 million a day, though that figure comes from his own telling, rather than any court finding. Alongside the drugs, he poured money into legitimate ventures, too. A recording studio, real estate holdings, a limousine service, the beginnings of a businessman's portfolio. His convictions came in two waves. In the late 1980s, a California state court convicted him of the kidnapping and attempted murder of a distant relative named James Lester, who had been part of the drug ring, and sentenced him to 25 years to life. Then, in 1990, the same federal trial that convicted Bennett and Villabona convicted Harris of cocaine trafficking, adding roughly 19 years and 7 months on top. Between the state case and the federal one, he was staring at a combined sentence that would keep him locked away well past any reasonable expectation of ever walking free. And for years, that is exactly what it did. By any ordinary measure, his life outside was over. What happened next is one of the strangest chapters in music history. In the fall of 1991, Harris says he had his attorney, David Kenner, connect him with Suge Knight, and that he invested $1.5 million to help launch the venture that became Death Row Records, with his wife, Lydia Harris, fronting the business because a prisoner cannot legally run a company. Knight has long disputed that account, crediting the label's funding to major industry players instead. Whatever the true origin, Death Row went on to generate hundreds of millions of dollars behind Dr. Dre, Snoop, and Tupac, while the man who says he seeded it sat in a cell watching an empire rise on money he could not touch. If a fortune like that was built on money that came from a prison cell, who was ever going to be paid back? That question moved into the courts, and it stayed there for 20 years. Lydia Harris sued, and in 2005, a Los Angeles judge awarded a default judgment of $107 million against Knight and Death Row after Knight's side violated discovery rules. The judgment helped push Death Row into bankruptcy the following year, and the story only grew more tangled from there. Lydia collected only a fraction of what she was owed, somewhere around $1 million, and the judgment itself was contested, voided, and revived over the years that followed. As recently as November of 2025, a federal judge dismissed her latest attempt to collect on that same $107 million claim, this time filed against Snoop Dogg, who now owns the label, along with Knight and others. 20 years on, the money that supposedly started it all was still being fought over in courtrooms, and Lydia Harris still held almost none of it. Harris's own release came in stages. In 2011, California granted him state parole, but federal marshals immediately took him into custody to serve the remaining drug sentence, and he stayed there another decade. Then, on January 20th, 2021, the president commuted his sentence, and Harris walked out of the federal facility at Lompoc that same day, after about 33 years. His attorney called the sentence unduly harsh and the relief long overdue. A prominent criminal justice advocate said plainly that he should have been home a decade earlier. Harris himself has said that the day a person finally takes responsibility for what they have done is the day their life begins to change. The commutation made Harris one of the most unusual figures ever to receive presidential clemency, a former cocaine trafficker whose money is said to have helped build a label that reshaped American music. Death Row's roster, at its height, defined an entire era, and the man who claims to have seeded it spent that era behind concrete and steel, unable to touch a dollar of it. Since his release, he has leaned into a public second act, endorsing the president who freed him in the fall of 2024, and framing his long sentence and sudden freedom as a story about accountability and redemption. As of today, Michael Harris is a free man and serves as Chief Operating Officer of the relaunched Death Row Records, while also running a nonprofit focused on community work. He remains one of the only figures in this story to walk out of a decades-long sentence and back into the very empire his money is said to have started. Harris built legitimate companies to launder both his money and his image. A few miles north, in Pasadena, another Bloods-connected figure took that same instinct much further. He did not just buy himself a respectable front. He bought the loyalty of an entire neighborhood. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Elrader Ray Browning. In the neighborhoods of Pasadena and Altadena, there was a drug dealer who paid his neighbors' electric bills, covered their groceries, and hired local teenagers to sit outside and listen to police scanners for him. His name was Elrader Browning, and for a while that generosity bought him something more valuable than muscle. It bought him silence. What that silence cost the people around him is a story the public record has only ever told in pieces. Browning, known on the street as Ray, ran his operation out of Pasadena and Altadena from the late 1970s through the crack years, and he came up out of the Pasadena-Denver Lane Bloods. Much of what is known about the sheer size of his organization comes from the published, first-hand account of one of the investigators who worked the case, which is worth keeping in mind as the numbers get large. By that account, Browning's network was tied both to the Black Guerrilla family prison gang and to Colombian suppliers, and it reached from Los Angeles all the way to Kansas City and Detroit, a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The takedown, after a year-long investigation, is where those numbers land. Investigators seized more than 15 pounds of crack and powder cocaine, more than $300,000 in cash, and 10 luxury vehicles, and they flagged more than $13 million in property and bank accounts for forfeiture. And the community goodwill was not an accident. Browning covered utility bills and grocery runs for the families around him, and he paid teenagers to monitor police scanners, weaving himself so tightly into the neighborhood that the people best positioned to talk had every reason not to. He had turned an entire community into a kind of shield. The alliance behind it was what made Browning unusual. A Pasadena street trafficker who could plug into both the Black Guerrilla family, one of the most disciplined prison gangs in the country, and directly into Colombian supply, sat at a rare crossroads of power. It gave his organization a reach a simple corner operation could never have, and a reputation that traveled far beyond his own blocks. For years, that combination made him almost impossible to touch. Money came in from the cartels, structure and muscle came from the prison gangs, and the neighborhood would not talk. Building a case against him meant getting past all three at once. But how do you prosecute a man when the community that could testify against him has been paid, one favor at a time, to look away? The court record, which is firmer ground than the legend, tells a darker story than the bill-paying benefactor. In the early 1980s, Browning was convicted in connection with the 1982 firebombing and shooting of a home belonging to the aunt and uncle of a drug rival named Pancho Barnes. Prosecutors argued it was competition in the drug trade that had motivated it. He was convicted of arson, of possessing a destructive device, and of shooting at an inhabited dwelling, and he served a 10-year term. A 1985 California appeals ruling later reversed that conviction over whether a prior conviction of his could be used against him at trial, and in doing so, it revealed something about Browning that the community goodwill had obscured. He already had a prior conviction for taking a life. The federal case is where the full weight came down, and where the cost of that neighborhood silence became clear. Browning and a black guerrilla family figure known as Doc Holliday were arrested, and within a week, the key informant in the case was taken from her Altadena apartment, and her life was ended. Both men were convicted in federal court on drug and conspiracy charges, and by the investigators' account, received life sentences, with gang histories dating the federal conviction to 1988. His wife, Hazel Browning, had been arrested in cocaine raids back in December of 1983, and his brother Rodney was taken in as well, in an operation where Los Angeles police used explosives to breach a home for the first time in the department's history. That single detail says a great deal about how fortified and how feared his organization had become. The department had never needed to blow its way into a residence before. Browning's operation was the reason it happened. The timing of the informant's death was the part that chilled investigators most. She had agreed to help build the case against him, and within days of the arrests, she was gone, taken from her own apartment and never seen alive again. Whether or not it could ever be tied to Browning in a courtroom, the message it sent through Pasadena and Altadena was impossible to miss. Cooperating with the government carried a price, and now everyone in those neighborhoods understood exactly what it was. As of the most recent accounts, L. Raider Browning is reported to be serving a life sentence, though his exact current custody status is not clearly documented in the public record. Of every name here, his is the one that history has kept most in shadow, an empire remembered mostly through the account of the man who helped bring it down. Almost every name in this trade belonged to a man. But a few miles south, in South Central, one of the most feared operators of the entire crack era was a woman, and she had built her network from the ground up, entirely on her own. Jemiker Thompson Hairston. She was 8 years old when her family was put out of their South Central apartment, and she decided, standing there that day, that she would never be powerless with money again. By the time she was in high school, she was moving kilos of cocaine. By her 30s, she was one of the most feared drug figures in Los Angeles, a woman the city came to know as the Queen-Pin. Jemiker Thompson rose through the 1980s crack epidemic in South Central, and her life would later be cited as an inspiration for a character on the television series Snowfall. She started small, collecting payments for her boyfriend Anthony Mosley's marijuana business, but she moved up fast, selling 3 to 4 kilos of cocaine a week while she was still a teenager. She and Mosley married in 1980, moved into crack, bought a home in the San Fernando Valley, and had a son in 1982. What set Thompson apart was not just that she sold, but that she ran things. In a trade almost entirely controlled by men, she gave the orders, set the prices, and moved the weight herself. She has said she learned early, standing outside that empty apartment, that she wanted money and that she wanted to control everything around her, and she built a life designed to deliver exactly that. By the late 1980s, few people in South Central did not know the name, and fewer still were willing to cross her. Then, around 1984, Mosley's life was taken, and rather than fold, Thompson took the operation over and grew it. She recruited distributors in cities as far away as Atlanta and Philadelphia, and at times she bought her cocaine directly from Colombian producers, cutting out the middlemen. She ran a hair products distribution company that she insisted was a legitimate business, though authorities described it as a money laundering front. In her own telling later, she was serious about the trade and did not play when it came to delivering her product and collecting what she was owed. By the height of it, her network stretched across state lines, with product and cash moving between Los Angeles and the East Coast, and her name carrying real weight on both ends of the pipeline. She was not a figurehead sitting behind a man's operation. She was the operation. The hair products company gave the money somewhere to hide, a paper trail of invoices, inventory, and deliveries that could sit on top of the cash. Investigators never bought it. To them, it was a laundry, a clean face bolted onto a cocaine business that spanned the country. The end came through someone close to her. After her business partner, Percy Bratton, was arrested with kilos of cocaine and began cooperating with investigators, Thompson was indicted, and she ran. For roughly 2 years, she stayed a step ahead of the authorities, until they guessed correctly that she would not miss her son's 6th grade graduation. In 1993, they were waiting for her there. For 2 years, she had lived as a fugitive, changing her movements and staying invisible, doing everything necessary to avoid exactly this moment. In the end, it was not a wiretap or an informant that undid her. It was her own son's graduation. The one event investigators were certain a mother like her would never miss. What does the justice system do with a woman who built an empire most men in the trade never came close to? She was charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine and with 5 counts of money laundering. She was convicted, and she was sentenced to 15 years, though she has said she was initially staring down 25 years to life before the judge handed her the lesser term. That gap between the sentence she feared and the one she got is the kind of margin that decides whether a person ever gets a second life at all. For Thompson, it meant she would still be young enough, when she came out, to build something entirely new. She served her time alongside some of the most notorious women in the federal system, including the Colombian cartel matriarch Griselda Blanco and Lynette Frome, the one-time follower of Charles Manson, who had tried to shoot a president. Thompson was released in 2005 after roughly 12 to 13 years behind bars, and the woman who walked out was not the one who had gone in. She had converted to Christianity in prison, and she founded a ministry in South Central called Second Chance Evangelical Ministries. She co-wrote a 2010 memoir about her life, titled Kingpin, with the writer David Ritz, and she told her story on documentary series for both A&E and for Netflix. As of today, she is married to a man named Champ Hairston, and her son, once the graduation that finally drew her into the open, grew up to become a professional skateboarder. It is a rare arc in this world. Most of the names here ended in a cell or a grave or a courtroom that is still in session. Thompson ended hers in a pulpit. Thompson closed her chapter in the drug world and rebuilt her life fully in the open. The next name on this list has no such ending, at least not yet. His story is still being argued inside a Las Vegas courtroom, and it runs directly through the death of one of the most famous artists who ever lived, Dwayne "Kef" D. Davis. For years, Dwayne Davis told the story to anyone who would listen. He put it in interviews. He put it in a memoir with his name on the cover. He described being inside the car the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. And then, nearly 30 years later, prosecutors took those same words and built a first-degree murder charge around them. Davis, known as Kef D., was born in Watts around 1963 and raised in Compton, where he became a leader and, by his own description, a shot caller for the Southside Compton Crips, running with the Crips from the time he was a boy in the early 1970s. In his 2019 memoir, Compton Street Legend, he described rising to run what he called a multi-million-dollar drug operation with a national reach. And he said a prison stretch for dealing in the late 1980s had turned him into a hardened figure. The night that would define his life came on September 7, 1996. Shots were fired at Tupac Shakur's car near the Las Vegas Strip, only hours after a brawl inside a casino that had involved Davis's nephew, Orlando Anderson, and Shakur. Shakur was gravely wounded and passed 6 days later, on September 13th, at just 25 years old. By Davis's own long-repeated account, he had obtained a handgun and passed it into the back seat of the Cadillac from which the shots came. Authorities framed the whole thing as part of the East Coast and West Coast rivalry of the era, tangled up with death row records and the long feud between Bloods and Crips. For decades, the people who knew the most were beyond reach. Orlando Anderson, long considered the prime suspect and never charged, was fatally shot in Compton in 1998. The two other men who had been in the car that night have since died as well. The case sat cold, and it seemed likely to stay that way. If a man spends years describing his own part in a death out loud, can those words alone be enough to convict him? That question is exactly what the courts are now being asked to answer. On July 17, 2023, Las Vegas police searched a Henderson, Nevada home connected to Davis's wife, and they seized computers, .40 caliber ammunition, a magazine featuring Tupac, and a copy of Davis's own book. On September 29, 2023, a Clark County grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder with a deadly weapon and a gang enhancement, making him the only person ever charged in the case. The county sheriff pushed back hard on any notion that the department had never cared about solving it. To him, the indictment was proof the case had mattered all along, even through the long years when it looked abandoned. Prosecutors were blunt about where their case came from. For years, they said, Davis had incriminated himself, first in interviews stretching back to 2008, and then in the pages of his own 2019 book, describing that night in a level of detail no ordinary bystander could have known. His arrest was the first real break in an investigation that had gone cold for nearly 3 decades. Davis pleaded not guilty. He was briefly granted bail of $750,000 and placed on house arrest. But that arrangement was undone after prosecutors challenged where the bail money had come from, tracing it to a prominent music industry manager and raising questions the court was not willing to set aside. Over the years, Davis had told the story more than one way. Sometimes he placed himself at the center of that night. Sometimes he denied being anywhere near it. After his arrest, he argued that the versions in which he took part had been performance, told to sell books and fill interviews, and not because they were true. His attorneys moved to dismiss the case, arguing he had once been given immunity in an earlier arrangement, but the judge, Carly Kearney, found no proof any such deal had ever existed. The trial date kept sliding from 2024 to early 2026, and then to August 10, 2026. After Davis changed lawyers and his new defense described the mountain of evidence they had to review as overwhelming. In 2025, he was convicted of a jailhouse battery after a fight with another inmate and sentenced to a term of 16 to 40 months. As of the middle of 2026, Dwayne Davis remains held in Clark County, awaiting a first-degree murder trial set to begin on August 10th. He has pleaded not guilty and continues to insist he is innocent, saying prosecutors have no gun, no car, and nothing that places him at the scene, and that the words being used against him were only ever meant as entertainment. If he is convicted, He faces the possibility of life in prison. Nothing here has been decided. This is the one case on this list that has not yet found its ending. Davis traces his own beginnings to the birth of the Crips in the early 1970s. But the business he stepped into was already old by then. Before the Crips and the Bloods ever carved up the cocaine trade, one man in Los Angeles was doing big dope first, and nearly everyone who came after him was in some way following a path he had drawn. Thomas "Tootie" Reese. Before Freeway Rick Ross, before the Crips and the Bloods turned cocaine into a citywide war, there was one name that came first. He drove a Rolls-Royce through South Central in the 1960s. He is credited with helping bring freebasing to Los Angeles, and a young Rick Ross once idolized him from a distance. They called Thomas Reese the Godfather. Reese, known as Tootie, was described by a longtime Los Angeles narcotics detective as the kingpin of the 50s and 60s, and as probably one of the first black dealers in the city to move real weight. He was active from the mid-1960s, dealing heroin and marijuana first, then moving into cocaine as it climbed. He is credited with helping popularize freebasing around 1976, reportedly among some well-known users of the day. That single shift, from powder into something a person could smoke, would help set the stage for the crack wave that swallowed the city a decade later, though Reese would not be the one to profit from it. Freeway Rick Ross would later say that Reese was a man he had wanted to be like, a hero to him before the two of them became rivals. He belonged to a Los Angeles that barely survives in the record anymore, a heroin and marijuana underworld that came before the crack economy and the gang wars bolted onto it. He did business by hand and on his own terms, and for the better part of 2 decades, that was enough to make him the most important dealer in the city. The scale of his operation was, in truth, a little blurry even at the time. In one recorded meeting, Reese told undercover agents he was receiving around 100 kilos of cocaine every 2 months, though investigators later suspected his operation was more modest than the newspapers made it sound. What was not in doubt was the style. He handled deals himself, once producing a shotgun during one of them, and he moved through the city in a Rolls-Royce, a Corvette, and a Datsun. He was connected to the Oakland kingpin Felix Mitchell, part of a generation of West Coast dealers who came before the gangs took over. For years, he seemed untouchable. He was arrested on cocaine charges in 1972, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years, only to have it reversed on appeal. He was acquitted of income tax evasion in 1976, and acquitted again of a narcotics distribution charge in 1978. 3 times the system reached for him, and 3 times he slipped free. Each acquittal built the legend a little higher. Prosecutors would charge him, the papers would cover it, and Reese would walk over and over until it began to look as though the law simply could not hold him. So what finally brought down a man who had beaten the government again and again? Patience, and a long federal investigation that began in 1979. It took years to close. On June 30th, 1983, undercover agents made contact through a Reese associate named Kevin Morgan, and a series of undercover buys followed. On December 1st, 1983, Reese and his wife, Linda, sold 2 kilos of cocaine to the agents for $50,000 at a hotel in Marina del Rey, and were arrested on the spot. A 24-count indictment was unsealed the next day. In a bench trial before United States District Judge Richard Gadbois, Reese was convicted on June 19, 1984, on 20 of the 24 counts. He was acquitted of running a continuing criminal enterprise, the single charge that would have carried an automatic life sentence. It was the closest the government would ever come to putting him away for good, and it missed. Linda was convicted on 6 counts. He had faced up to 129 years and a fine of $345,000, and she had faced up to 60 years. In the end, Reese was sentenced to 35 years, though an appeals court later vacated that sentence and sent it back over improper submissions the prosecution had made to the judge. Linda received 10 years. A father of 13 children, Reese told the Los Angeles Times that it was over, that this time he had been wrong, that he had been there with the merchandise and had sold it, and that he accepted his fate. He insisted on one thing, though. He said he had never sold to children. By the time he went down, the world he had ruled was already leaving him behind. The crack era and a younger, far more violent generation of dealers had turned him into something of a relic, a figure from an older Los Angeles. But his fingerprints are on everything that came after. The dealers who turned the city into a cocaine capital in the 1980s grew up in a Los Angeles he had already shaped. Freeway Rick Ross idolized him. A younger generation studied the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the way he had stayed free for so long. When people trace where the modern Los Angeles drug trade truly began, the path keeps leading back to the same man. Thomas Reese has since died. The godfather of the city's drug trade outlived his own empire, and then quietly faded out of the story he had started, long before most of the people who followed his blueprint ever learned his name. 8 names, 1 city, and more than half a century of a trade that reshaped Los Angeles from the sidewalks up. Some of them are gone, some walked free and rebuilt their lives, and one still sits in a cell waiting for a verdict that could define the rest of his. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.